Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. We are going to begin our second day with the first conference. Thank you to Sheila Barker, who is with Studio Incamminati and founder of the Jane Fortune program on women artists. Today, Professor Barker will talk about starting the conversation with pictures, how art collecting gave women a voice. You have the floor, ma'am.
I must first of all thank Professor Noelia Garcia Perez for the great honor of an invitation to this important cycle of conferences that she has conceived, which have done so much to advance the state of research and to spark new curiosity. I also wish to thank the conference organizers and the great work of Paloma Malaga Shaw. I thank the other speakers for their contributions, and I thank also the direction of the Prado Museum for their enlightened leadership in sponsoring these conferences. Collecting was a bold enterprise for a woman. To understand its significance in the early modern period, it helps to recall that legal codes, especially in Italy, largely impeded women from owning property. For the most part, they were not able to engage autonomously in the binding legal contracts that were frequently used to commission works of art. Women usually did not inherit the estates of their family members except through explicit testamentary arrangements. And in such cases, male custodians or stewards were often designated. In the case of widowhood, the jewels, the clothes given to them by their husbands remained theirs, but nearly every other aspect of the marital household, what today we would consider joint marital property, transferred to the ownership of the deceased husband's male line. In consideration of all these legal obstacles to women's ownership of property, the act of collecting paintings, sculptures, and other valuable artworks was, in and of itself, a bold act for women in this period, and it was a means of participating in a realm largely dominated by men, that is, the control of property. Women's collecting can also be understood as a deliberate act of self-fashioning, that is to say, the cultivation of a public identity for the sake of social currency, upward mobility, or other prerogatives. And this is one of the focuses of my talk today. The state of research on early modern female art collectors and women's patronage reflects a steadily growing body of case studies on individuals of extreme importance, such as Isabella d'Este, Mary of Hungary, and Queen Christina of Sweden, about whom we will hear much today. At this stage in the scholarship, however, there is a need to know just as much about general patterns as there is about the individual women collectors. And therefore, these conferences organized by Professor Noelia Garcia Perez are a vital means of making progress on these questions. At last year's conference, Professor Sheila set us on a solid foundation when she spoke of the close association between female patrons and the stile devoto, literally translated as pious manner. The stile devoto refers to devotional art that employs modestly clothed figures, very simplified compositions, pared down subject matter, and a deliberately rustic technique that abstains from virtuosic artistry, such as seen in the works by the nuns who were working in the workshop of Plautilla Nelli at the convent of Santa Caterina da Siena in 16th century Florence. But the stile devoto, though very important for understanding women's taste in art, hardly suffices to explain all the kinds of art that women collected. Let's take the case of Plautilla Nelli herself. Let's think of her as a kind of collector based upon the imagery in her artworks. This woman artist of the late 16th century, who gained great renown for reviving the stile devoto of an earlier century, took great pride in the sophisticated objects that were within her monastery's communal collection of objects, things that had been left to the convent through the testamentary inheritances of the other nuns. So, for example, we see Hartmann Schädel's Geographic Atlas, which belonged to the convent, being referenced in her image of the Lamentation as the city of Jerusalem in the background. And we also see references to Raimondi's Prince after Raphael, of which her convent had a collection of something like 600. Obviously, many were in multiples. They had been brought to the convent through a nun who was the heir of the great Rossi printing house. We also see in her Last Supper indications of export-style crockware from China, and this is, again, an extraordinary object that must have belonged to the convent in consideration of the clausura that was in effect at this time. The two altarpieces that I've just showed you were not within the closed part of the convent, but rather they were within the convent church that was accessible to Florence's public. Thus, even while the nuns' most precious possessions remained invisible due to clausura, Nelli's paintings served to publicize a collection about which they were very proud, a collection which helped them brandish a compelling image of a monastic life that was enriched by secular learning and curiosity about the wider world. As we consider such cases, we can keep in mind the fact that, as with men, women's amassing of collections was not a private affair. They were extensions of the owner's self-identity, and they were meant for others to see and admire. Art collections became surrogates for their female owners, allowing them, in many cases, to enter male discourse and even to initiate and shape the topics of conversation with a level of freedom that they did not have in person because of very strict ideals of female decorum in the presence of men, usually regarding the necessity that they remain quiet unless spoken to, or that they demur when the conversation moved to topics beyond their supposed realm of expertise. For these reasons, collections ought to be understood as having had a strategic function as a tool for shaping social relations. And the collection itself must be regarded with caution because it is a carefully fashioned and curated aspect of the ideal self. It is not transparent, immediate access to someone's real identity. One useful case study from the 16th century is provided by the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici. She amassed an incredible 551 portraits on paper by François Clouet and his contemporaries, a number of which she commissioned, these being mostly portraits of her own children. During the 1560s, she devoted obsessive care, not to the children, but to the curation of these objects, arranging and annotating this collection of unbound works that she kept in special boxes, and these boxes were kept in a private chamber. The enormous size of her collection and the energy she devoted to it suggests that Catherine de' Medici's avid interest in collecting and commissioning family portraits was not merely an outgrowth of personal sentiment. Take, for example, the portraits she commissioned of her children. While her children were small, Catherine was often living at a distance from them in order to carry out her role at the apex of politics, governing a nation. In this period, the artwork served as portable surrogates for her offspring. By keeping these drawings with her, Catherine could, of course, prove to her critics that she remained attentive to maternal concerns. But long after the children had grown up, the drawings continued to shore up Catherine's power. Later in this period, the drawings became witnesses to her multitude of healthy male and female progeny who, as powerful adults, cemented dynastic continuity with their own control and power and with their own numerous marital alliances. This continued strategic use of the drawings to reinforce her own power as her children grew up is indicated by the inscription she added to the British Museum's portrait of her son, Charles. From the apparent age of Charles, we know now that it must have been part of a group of portraits that Catherine commissioned of her children around 1556. The inscription it bears, however, refers to Charles IX as king, and therefore the inscription must have been added long after Charles' coronation in 1561. We see in this way that she continued to show visitors her drawing of Charles as a baby boy long after he had begun to transform into a very different kind of individual, an adult male who occupied the throne of France. The drawing at that point no longer would have signified likeness or real presence. It had instead become a memento of the moment when the king was closest to Catherine's flesh and most dependent on his mother. In this sense, it was like the Christ child element in the Theotokos icon, serving to demonstrate why the mother deserves our respect and veneration. In this way, the hundreds of drawings in Catherine's family members in her famous and massive portrait collection serve to vaunt her genealogical access to royal power and to demonstrate that this access, thanks to her many powerful relatives, would continue throughout her widowhood. After this consideration of portraiture in women's collections, let us now turn our attention to women's use of collections as a means of both developing and demonstrating their study of antiquity. Perhaps the first woman to make waves as a collector of antiquities was the Duchess of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, in the early 16th century. Isabella utilized agents and an intense campaign of correspondence to her large network in order to acquire bronzes, metals, gems, as well as a few larger sculptures, such as a Cupid that was attributed to Praxiteles and fragments from the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. These were highly sought-after objects for whose ownership she competed with men in an international public arena. And her success, even more than money, which the northern despots she competed with often lacked, depended on a network of contacts and on the strength of her position in the social order. Her success also depended upon her skills in manipulating that position. She made efforts to study Latin and classical text in order to enhance her understanding of her collections and further her success as an inquisitor. And she became an authority in this way on classical statuary. Her family members often resorted to her for opinions on the matter. Yet, for all of the apparent worthiness of her collecting of antiquities, this activity involved a level of risk. As shown by Rosemarie San Juan, Isabella broke with a decorum for her gender when she took interest in pagan culture, an elite male realm of secular humanistic learning. But the payoff was an expansion of her courtly influence. The ancient artworks attracted attention from court visitors and drew them into the spaces that she had created for herself within the court at Mantua. The curious conjunction of Isabella's rare objects and the allegorical paintings near them stimulated sociability and polite discussion among the courtiers and diplomats who gathered there to see the famed collection and to practice connoisseurship. Her collection, in this way, was a starting point for the conversations among the men of the ruling class, whose humanistic education was predicated on the idea that verbal eloquence was the most effective means for an individual to demonstrate the cultural and moral superiority that legitimized a ruler's authority over others. After Isabella's bold path-breaking example, it was easier for subsequent women to embrace the study of antiquity and the collecting of its material remains, and thus, through these objects, to gain control of those conversations around antiquities that had been so important for men's hierarchical status. Antique themes and forms figure in the iconography of the Medici woman collector who was at the foundation moment of the Medici Grand Duchy, Duchess Eleonora de Toledo, currently the subject of an important exhibition that has just opened at the Uffizi Museum, curated by Bruce Edelstein. In a very noteworthy early case of grotesque ensembles in Florence, Eleonora de Toledo had Ridolfo del Ghirlandaio decorate the walls of her Sala Verde in Palazzo Vecchio with groteschi. As demonstrated by Professor Edelstein, the perfection of these grotesques gained the admiration of an art expert of the status of Giorgio Vasari, who cited them in his essay in the 1568 edition of the Lives of the Artist called How to Work Grotesques on Stucco. In this essay, Vasari reminds us why it was so courageous and risky for women to associate themselves with pagan art. He says, grotesque are a licentious and a very ridiculous sort of painting, full of deformed and monstrous things, without any adherence to rules. Considering that Vasari wrote this while he was a servant of the Medici court, this pejorative view of grotesque painting must have been more than his personal opinion. It must have been a widespread view. And yet, we must marvel. This grotesque decoration was precisely what was desired by Eleonora de Toledo, as Professor Edelstein has convincingly demonstrated. In his judgment, the antique subject matter served the Duchess by subtly invoking her family lineage, since, as Vasari himself points out, Eleonora's father had built a palace in Pozzuoli near the famous ancient grotesques. This explanation is convincing, but let us not overlook also how bold Eleonora was in making this artistic choice. In this era, the study of pagan culture, especially in its licentious, sensual, and monstrous aspects, was seen as a strictly masculine precinct. The art of antiquity, rife with nude figures and sexual allusions, was very much at odds with the stile devoto that is stereotypically associated with women's artistic preferences. Isabella d'Este's collecting of ancient art and Eleonora de Toledo's commission of grotesques subtly aligned these women with patrons, subtly aligned these women patrons with the virtu and intellectual sophistication of their male peers. Thus, by extension, antique objects and antique themes aligned women with the masculine qualities pertaining to good governance and rulership, and were a somewhat risky yet potent tool, as we've seen, for self-fashioning. The bold choice by a woman collector to associate herself with the objects and themes of antiquity was not limited to the nobility. The female artist Lavinia Fontana was raised in 16th century Bologna by the painter Prospero Fontana, her father, himself a learned artist who collected art, plaster cast, antiquities, as well as books, all of which passed to his daughter along with his workshop upon his death, his daughter and her husband. Lavinia was no stranger to her father's network of male scholars, nor to the learned topics of their discussions. She painted portraits of several of these scholars, whose learning is indicated through the presence of their book collections, as we see, for instance, in her portrait of the physician Girolamo Mercuriale. Following the same formula of identifying and characterizing the male sitter, showing him amidst a collection of objects related to the intellectual concerns of humanist, Lavinia chose to present herself amidst the collection of antiquities and casts in the Fontana workshop. In this self-portrait of Lavinia Fontana, made shortly after her marriage, we can see how deliberately she has taken on the mantle of a collector of antiquities. And in fact, it doesn't look like a workshop at all. It looks more like an idealized studiolo. The size of her collection is visible on the shelves behind her, but she has also removed two statuettes, a nude male figure, and to her right, a crouching Venus, in order to study them better and make sketches. Fontana's choice to bring the nude male figure in close rapport with her own identity might seem at first a daring provocation. But Fontana clearly wanted to draw attention to the chaste use of her own sculptures rather than real bodies in order to gain mastery of the male and female nude, the foremost arenas for artists to demonstrate professional excellence. Fontana's later entrance into the field of erotic paintings, with pictures such as this one of the pagan deities Mars and Venus in their bedchamber, or this one, a large nude Minerva, confirms that Fontana was well aware of the potential of classic mythology to open a pathway to sensuality. I have demonstrated elsewhere that a number of women artists did in fact make sensual and erotic imagery. But what of women collectors of erotic imagery? Not all of these women collectors could have been as guarded as Isabella d'Este, who scolded Perugino for inserting immodest nude figures into her painting. It has been established through the study of inventories that, for instance, the wealthy female prostitutes in 17th century Holland and Italy regularly collected art with lascivious imagery. We may suppose that these courtesans regarded such paintings as useful for setting the mood in their salons for passionate encounters. Yet the erotic paintings also said something about their owners. By demonstrating the courtesan's disposable wealth, as well as her bold indifference to the behavioral norms for women of those times, these erotic images in their collections declared the autonomy of these women. Before we hasten to categorize prostitutes who collected as antitypes to the genteel women who collected, it may be, in fact, that the two groups had more in common than we might think. Queen Henrietta Maria of England, for instance, commissioned paintings of the story of Psyche for her bedchamber at Greenwich Palace. And that's, of course, a love story that involves a discovery in the bed. Very racy imagery. For the same room, she also had Guido Reni make a painting of a Bacchus and Ariadne. This painting, before it left Italy, was seen by papal agent Carlo Rossetti. Rossetti, in fact, had judged the Queen's painting too lascivious to send to her, saying, "I hesitate to send it for fear of further scandalizing those heretics," meaning the English Protestants. And he insisted that the painting first get approval from the Queen's confessor before it be allowed to be put on display. Of course, it was put on display. These erotic pagan mythologies, of course, were but a small fraction of Henrietta Maria's collection. The inventories show that the majority of her artworks had Catholic iconographies. Yet, before we can draw any conclusions about the chasteness of the artworks in the Queen's collection, sheerly on the basis of their Catholic religious iconography, we should first consider that some of these images may have been quite sensual in their appearance, like this penitent Magdalene from Palma Giovane, which belonged to Henrietta Maria's husband, King Charles I. Indeed, paintings of Catholic saints could at times be very sensual and seductive. So with this paper, we've had an opportunity to consider several realms of iconographies and genres in which women's collecting activities pertained in the 16th and 17th centuries. We've heard about the stile devoto, which was typical. We've seen how they made important inroads into the collecting of antiquities, and this had high stakes for their position in politics and their ability to have a voice, if a throne voice, a voice at a distance, in spaces of the court and of the palace that were traditionally occupied by male courtiers. And of course, we've seen how women also ventured into the realm of erotic imagery. And this included both women who were very well thought of, as well as women with a tainted moral stance in society. I think we can learn from this that the categories of classical art and erotic art, as well as the traditional category of pious art in a woman's collection, all helped to project different kinds of visions of the female collector, often in strict tension with male prerogatives. Though the subjects of the artworks in their collections, through the subjects of the artworks in their collections, women were able to make very deliberate and calculated statements about themselves and to provoke dialogue on topics that might not have been possible to articulate directly verbally. And I think therein lies the reason that women have never stopped collecting since. Thank you.